Welcome to the Get Published podcast, sponsored by Brodie Consulting Group. To get more information about our publishing and coaching services, go to getpublishedpodcast.com. Hello, I am Paul Brodie, and thank you for joining us for another episode of the Get Published podcast, where we help authors get published with a proven system that works. Today, we're being joined by Patrick Schwerdtfeger, author of Keynote Mastery. Patrick, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Paul. I'm happy to be here.
And more importantly, did I pronounce your last name correctly?
Yeah, you did great. My last name is a disaster, so you did better than most. Patrick Schwerdtfeger. It sounded great.
Excellent. I always do my best on this. So if you're ready, let's go ahead and dig into the questions.
Yeah, let's jump in. Fire away.
All right, question number one. What is the one piece of advice that you would give to a first-time author who is currently writing their book?
You know, I mean, this is something I actually get asked a lot, and I know it sounds almost, trivial or maybe boring, but really the key to it is writing a great outline. Like, to me, writing the actual manuscript is intimidating. It's hard. I feel like, gosh, if I write one thing and then I forget what I've written and I end up repeating myself later on. But, I've written 5 books so far, and in every case, I sat down and I started with just some bullet point things I wanted to talk about, and then I put them in a different order and I added more, and then all of a sudden I thought, gosh, this one point is actually 4 separate points. And so you expand it and build it and expand it and build it. And every time so far, when I actually sat down to write my manuscript, I had like a 10-page outline of detailed notes, and it made it so much easier to actually write the book after the fact because I had that outline to keep me on track.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that because the outline, that is the key. That is your game plan, and then you can base it off of there. But you bring up another point, and that is when you're really digging deep into one of those talking points, one of those chapters, you could actually turn that into another book. And I actually did that with 2 of the chapters from my books. I was like, I can cover so much more info. One of the chapters was just do it. And I'm going, wow, I can do a complete book on this. And that's exactly what happened. It's just amazing what you can do when you have a game plan and you realize, okay, I have so much more info. Great, I'll just turn it into another book.
Yeah, it's really, I love it. So you had the exact same experience I did, particularly on my second book, where I realized that one portion of it was easily enough for an entire book itself, and that ended up becoming my third book. So this is the way it happens. And when you start teasing your mind and start looking and thinking about these things, inevitably you come up with all these other arguments and points and little data points that you want to include. And before you know it, a lot of times people think, gosh, if I have to write 60,000 words, that's a lot of words. It's not that much if you start with the outline, because you're going to see very quickly that you've got a lot in that head of yours, right? You've got a lot of experience. You've learned a lot. And then once you start mapping it out, you're like, gosh, I have a lot of things to cover. And you get to 60,000. My last book, the fourth one, was 78,000 words, and it came out quicker than any of the ones before it. So it happens fast.
Yeah, and especially when you get that inspiration where you start writing and you just can't stop.
Yeah, I love that. That's when you get into flow, and all of a sudden 6 hours has gone by and you're starving and you've written like 4,000 words all in one day. That's a good feeling. It's a good feeling.
I look at it as the equivalent of getting in the zone. Just like if you're doing sports, you have an activity, and you just get into that zone. And it's the same way with writing when you get into that flow, into that process.
Yeah, honestly, I don't get into it every time. Like I hope to, and it's an awesome feeling when I do. But I would say, out of every, I block writing sessions in my schedule, and I would say like maybe 1 out of every 4, I really get into a zone, and the time just goes, and I can just type nonstop. But there's also a lot, it's a lot of times when I struggle and I'm like, gosh, what do I say next? But the outline, it keeps me on track and it keeps me organized, and it makes it a lot easier to actually get all your thoughts on paper.
Yeah, I am a huge believer in regards to systems and frameworks and having those different processes. And the best system you can have is having that outline.
Yep, I couldn't agree with you more.
Well, what do you feel is the hardest part about getting published?
Well, I mean, it depends on the route that you choose, right? I mean, and this is, obviously besides writing the book itself, because that is obviously a big job. But if you're trying to go with a traditional publisher like Random House or, Wiley or any of those, Simon Schuster. Then the hard part is building your platform, and that's really the only thing they care about is what audience do you have, what email list, what social media following, what's your access to potential sales, and that's tricky. That takes time. But if you're self-publishing, either like completely self-publishing, like something like CreateSpace or Lulu, or if you're using one of these hybrid options, like what they call a vanity label, in that case, there's really nothing hard at all. I mean, you pay to play, and you literally have to write the manuscript and upload a PDF and a graphic for the cover, and you're done. Having said that, in that option, and really in either option, what's really, really tricky is book marketing. Marketing books is tricky, and I know we're going to talk about it later, but it's a moving target. It changes with time. So as the years go by, you have to take different strategies. But to me, that's the hardest part, is building a good marketing plan for the book.
Well, in regards to your books, were you traditionally published? Did you go the hybrid route? What was your journey?
Well, I've covered all three, actually. So the first two I did through Lulu, so that was just straight self-publishing. And then the third book was done through Wiley, John Wiley and Sons, which is a traditional publisher. So I have experience with that. That was an interesting. We can talk about that if we have time. And then the fourth and the fifth, I used a hybrid label called Authority Publishing that's based in Sacramento. And they did a great job. There's a lot of advantages. I mean, if you're going to do your own marketing, which I would argue you basically do either way, because the traditional publishers really don't do much for you. But if you're going to do your own marketing, you're just much better off using a vanity label, which is what I've done the last 2 times.
Yeah, I agree. One of the things that my publishing company specializes in is marketing and having the correct launch sequence, because most publishers, they're going to tell you, great, go market your book. Or they might set up some interviews, but at the end of the day, you're the one that has to promote that. So when I have people come to me and go, hey, the main thing I need help with is marketing, we're like, great, we have our systems. Follow this, we'll do it for you, we'll take care of it, and boom. Because you're right, people don't necessarily want to have to mess around with the marketing part of it.
Well, I mean, Paul, that's why you're doing so well. That's why I heard about you, is because you've built this formula. And let's face it, I mean, having that formula, and nothing's guaranteed, but having a roadmap that you can follow. Every author struggles with this. Even the popular authors, they all struggle with this. And you got to put your credit card on the table, right? You have to be willing to spend some money. And I've spent a lot of money marketing my books and marketing my business. So I'm not shy about marketing, but I want to know that the marketing's been tested, and there's how has it worked with this book and that book. Here's the high end, the low end. Here's generally what you can expect. Like, all of that information is almost impossible to find. And then there's a handful of companies, and yours among them, that's broken it down and has that strategy. I think it's great. I think that's why you're doing as well as you are.
Well, it's funny you mention that too, because one of the main things that I share is this is after tens of thousands of dollars of my own money, and also hundreds, if not thousands of hours of learning this whole process, because the whole thing with this is you have to learn it. So it's one of those things where the people that we do work with, it just makes it so much easier because they don't have to do it the hard way. They bring it to us and we take care of it.
Yeah. No, look, I think it's great.
Well, let's talk about Wiley a little bit. You said you wanted to talk about them for a moment.
Well, yeah, it's, so look, Wiley and all these traditional publishers, I mean, these are good companies. They're well-run companies. There's a value proposition that they offer. But the fact is that, you've already said much of it. They don't do much for you. You're kind of on your own. I think to a large extent, they'll basically mirror the amount of marketing you do yourself. So if you do X amount of marketing, they'll probably match that. But they're not going to do more than what you do, and in many cases they'll do less. Like, if you're not doing much, they won't. They'll send out a press release or two, and that's about it. But the bigger problem, to me, because I earn the vast majority of my income is speaking fees. So I go from one conference to the next. I do 40 or 50 each year. It's a big part. That's how I earn my living. And so there's a lot of people who, of course, a lot of the conferences buy 100 books or whatever, or they just ask me to bring books, which we sell on a one-off basis when we're at the event. But my landed cost on my third book through Wiley was $13.50. My landed cost. So if I sold it for, $20, I'm making less than $7. I'm making $6.50 on that book. And meanwhile, I've got to ship it. I've got, other expenses I have to cover. So meanwhile, with the vanity label and even with the first ones through Lulu, but I'll use the most recent one, my fifth one, my landed cost is less than $5. It's like $4.80. It depends on the quantity.
Mm-hmm.
But that unit cost is so much lower that if I sell it for $20, well, I'm actually going to make $15. And that makes, I sold 8,000 books one year in just one-off basis. So, if you're making $15 on 8,000 books, that's $120,000, right? So it ends up being a lot of money. And if your landed cost is only $13.50, you're chopping that down to 1/3 of what it would be otherwise.
Yeah, it's one of the things I always emphasize that there's so many different ways that you can monetize your book, and you just talked about a great example of that, and also maximizing your own costs that go into it with having to purchase books and spending so much per copy, because it can get expensive really quickly if you're not using the right distributor.
Yeah, it really can. It adds up in a hurry. But and also, I mean, when you order it, you gotta buy. If you want a good price, you gotta buy, 2 or 3 thousand. Or I remember once I bought 5,000 in one order. You buy 5,000 books, you're going to get a good price. But when you're working through a traditional publisher, even at that volume, you're still going to pay a lot. So there's advantages for sure to going the vanity label route.
Well, let's talk marketing. So please share a marketing strategy that you have used in your book launch that worked well.
Yeah, so let me. This is the best question. This is the one I was looking forward to. And like I said earlier, I mean, it's a moving target. These things do change. But the thing that I've done, I think that's worked the best is to identify people in my target market and proactively send copies or find a way to give copies to those people for free, and then follow up afterwards to get either book reviews on Amazon, or maybe they write a blog post or a book review on their blog, or even podcast interviews are very effective. But you have to reach out to those people ahead of time, find out who they are, reach out to them and see if they have any interest. And then like for example, the most recent book, the fifth one, I've sent out just shy of 400 to CEOs in the western states, so basically Arizona, Nevada, and then the 3 on the coast. And then afterwards, we followed up with those people to see, did they get it? Did they like it? And there's a variety of different things we can ask. The fourth book, the Keynote Mastery, which is all about becoming a professional speaker, which is what I do for a living. I actually went to the annual Toastmasters conference, which was in Washington, D.C., and I gave away 1,000 copies of my book for free, because that's precisely my target market. These are people who want to become speakers. And I gave out 1,000 copies of that book, and it made a huge impact. And the sales on Amazon went up, and of course I got a lot of book reviews as a result. I would say that ended up being the backbone of my marketing, was giving away those books at that conference.
Well, and the other thing with that too, the nice thing about when you do give away the book, each person that's there, especially if it's highly targeted, like you mentioned, each person there is a potential lead. Each person there is a potential $3,000, $5,000, even $10,000 speaking opportunity, and your unit cost might be $4 or $5. So it's well worth doing that.
Yeah, I mean, particularly in the second case more than the first. The folks at the Toastmasters conference, none of those people are going to hire me to speak. It's not the right audience for speaking. But certainly the second one, my most recent book, which is called Anarchy Inc., it's all about artificial intelligence and blockchain and technology trends. So sending those to CEOs has worked really well. In fact, I've already booked, I guess 3. I mean, I don't have the contract on the third one yet, but it is resulting in speaking engagements, and I do get I get a good speaking fee. So it's, from a cost perspective, it's well worth the effort. If you think about it, it costs me roughly between postage and the book itself. So let's say the book is $5, and the postage is about that as well. I mean, you have to include the envelope it goes in, and I have a couple of inserts that I put in there. So it's roughly $10 a book to send it out. So I sent out the first 200, so that cost me about $2,000. And then I did it again with just a little bit less than 200 the second time. So in and around $4,000 I spent to send those books out. and it's resulted in 3 speaking engagements, and I get a good fee. Like it's well worth the money to send it out and get that in return.
And what is your process in regards to the CEOs? Are you doing specific searches or reaching out to them via LinkedIn or social media and asking, hey, can I send you a copy of my book? What is your strategy to be able to send those books to those CEOs?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I actually buy a lot of lists. So I use a company called Exact Data, but there's many different list brokers, and I buy a lot of different lists of corporate event planners and meeting planners and speakers bureaus. I've bought lists for them and association management companies, and I also bought lists of CEOs in those states. And so you can itemize exactly what you're looking for, and you end up with 5,000 CEOs or whatever, and then you can start chipping away at it to be like, okay, I want people in these types of industries. I have I think it was like 250 negative keywords. So like religious references and so on, they're not going to be interested in technology, or there's all sorts of different things that I could eliminate and take out of that list. And then once I had kind of a good targeted list, then we just reached out by email. The list came with email addresses and say, we'd like to send you a book free of charge, no obligations. Please let me know if you'd be interested. And we got 400 and sent them out. So, and that list might have cost me, gosh, I don't remember exactly what it was, but maybe $1,000, $1,200. It's not that much money. And you end up with a targeted list of exactly the sorts of people that you want to target.
So essentially the company, it sounds like the company you're using, they do a lot of data mining. So you're able to target exactly what you're looking for, and then you're able to reach out from that point.
Yeah, I mean, list brokers, God only knows how they put their lists together, but that's their job. I mean, they have lists for everything. So, and they're always trying to sell the data. So, how they come up with their lists, I'm not really sure, but to buy them doesn't cost that much. I spend, maybe about 70,000 a year, 80,000 a year on marketing. So I spend quite a bit of money on marketing in my speaking business and also to promote my books. So to spend $1,000 or $2,000 on a list to send that information to the right people, to me, that's a no-brainer.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk about your favorite book. So what is your favorite book, and what was the number one thing that you learned from it?
Yeah, this is another good one. And for me, I'm sure you find this doing these podcasts. I mean, the people who read a lot, and I'm one of those guys. I go through a ton of books. So I thought about this a little bit, and there's like a whole bunch that I think are excellent books, of course, but there's one that I read, I mean, it was probably 3 years ago now, but it changed my perspective, actually. And I'll tell you about that in a second. But the book is Bold: How to Go Big, Make Bank, and Better the World by Peter Diamandis and Steve Kotler. And that's actually the follow-up book to their first book that they wrote together called Abundance, which is a similar idea. And I'll tell you, so I bought this book called The End of Oil, or The End of the Party, or something. I think it was The End of Oil. And then Abundance. I bought those 2 books at the same time, and I read one right after the other. And of course, the first one was absolutely apocalyptic. I mean, just the world is coming to an end. We've been, just feeding off of the oil boom for 200 years, and that's coming to an end. Very, very pessimistic, and we're ruining the planet and so on. And then I read Abundance, and it was precisely the opposite perspective. And it was saying that technology is evolving along an exponential curve, and it is coming just in the nick of time because we are saving this planet right now. And I really believe that that's true in almost every field, like in the energy sector with solar and renewables, and some of the things that they're doing to actually take carbon out of the air and take carbon out of the oceans. Like one of the big problems with pollution and carbon dioxide, people don't realize, is that it ends up in the ocean, and it's an acidification of the oceans, which can destroy the food chain if it gets too bad. We're not at that point yet, but if it gets much worse, that's one of the risks. And now there's actually technologies coming out where we can take carbon out. I mean, it's unbelievable, the things that are happening, and the birth rates dropping around the world, which is great news for the planet. So there's a lot of things happening, and that book, Abundance, followed by this one, Bold, those 2 books fundamentally changed my view of what we're doing on this planet, and I just think they're both outstanding books.
And for our final question, what is your favorite quote and why?
Yeah, an easy one. Bill Gates was famously said, most people overestimate what they can do in a year, but they underestimate what they can do in a decade. And I just think this is such a genius quote, and I couldn't agree with it more. The nature of exponential growth, the nature of progress, people overestimate what they can do in a year. Sometimes they're disappointed, but if you keep at it and you keep making those incremental steps forward, after 10 years, it's amazing how much you've accomplished. And it's true for me. I suspect it's true for you as well.
Yeah, it's amazing looking back going, wow, 10 years ago, I was starting to become a teacher. And 10 years later, business owner, publisher, and a coach. And I get to work from home. I have a 10-second commute.
So isn't that incredible?
It's funny how things evolve.
Yeah, no kidding. I never would have, I knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a speaker ever since I was like 10 years old. So I knew where I wanted to end up, but I never dreamt it would come, as quickly as it did, given the fact that the first few years were such a struggle and I just made no money. And I didn't realize how big the upside was. I didn't realize how big speaking fees can be. If you get established in that business, you can make a really nice income, and I love it. It's a great way to make a living.
Yeah, one of my all-time favorite things is to give seminars. When I wrote my second and third books, they were specifically to build my speaking business, and there's nothing better than getting out in front of a crowd and to be able to have them in the palm of your hand for an hour to give them great content and just know that it has an impact on them. When you have people come up to you and go, hey, that's the best seminar I've ever heard, there's no better feeling.
No, there really isn't. And when you get an email, 2 months later, and they tell you what they did as a result of, what they heard you say or whatever. I mean, it's a very rewarding thing. But aside from that, I mean, just in the most superficial analysis, it's a good income, right? It's a great way to make a living. Like people who think that you have to be poor, and struggling to be an author, that is not true. There's a lot of ways to make money in this world, and when you're an author, you can write 100 books. You only become an author once. Like the ROI on that first book is huge because you change from being just a person to being an author, and people treat you differently. Arguably, They shouldn't, but they do, and that to me is key. When you show up at an event, you're the keynote speaker. You've written a book or two. People treat you differently, and it's a lot of fun. I'm super grateful that I went down this path.
Well, as I say many times, the root word of authority is author.
That's a great saying. I couldn't agree with you more. Absolutely. Start with that.
Well, Patrick, I want to thank you for being a guest on the show. What is the best way for people to find you online?
If you know how to spell my name, I'm easy to find, but the easiest URL for you is bookpatrick.com. bookpatrick.com.
Well, Patrick, again, I want to thank you for being a guest on the show, and I wish you all the best in your author journey ahead.
Thank you, sir. Happy to be here.
Thanks again for joining us today. To learn more about how to get your book published with a proven system that works, grab a free copy of my book at getpublishedpodcast.com.